1975 was a big year for computers. The Altair 8800, the first commercially successful microprocessor-based computer, is released. Bill Gates and Paul Allen formed Microsoft in Albuquerque, and hobbyists Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs developed the Apple I prototype.
You already know my name. And you can see that I'm a machine.
I'm afraid. I'm afraid.
Welcome to the Final Girls podcast. I'm Anna Bogutska, your podcast host. I'm a critic and the author of the book Feeding the Monster. And in this series of the Final Girls show, I'm journeying through the intersections of horror and technology, from the very first robots of the silent film era to our most recent AI villains. Over the next few months, I'll be deep diving into machines. Every episode, I'm joined by a guest to discuss a film or two and how it captures our fears and anxieties around technology and the place it holds in our lives. In this episode, we're fully in the 70s and talking about a classic and a cult B-movie that both deal with the subjugation of women via technology. In The Stepford Wives, the 1975 classic based on Ira Levin's novel of the same name, a white picket fence suburban heaven that turns out to be a place where men can go and replace their wives with identikit big-boobied robots. An even darker take is Demon Seed, a deeply uncomfortable film made by Donald Cammell, the director best known for Performance. This one is about another super genius AI who imprisons the wife of his creator in her own home, forcing her to bear his machine baby. Starring two icons of 1960s counterculture movie stars, Catherine Ross in The Stepford Wives and Julie Christie in Demon Seed, both films are deeply bleak watches. But my conversation with Izzy Custodio, the mind behind the very excellent YouTube channel BeKindRewind, is not. And just a heads up, there is a little bit of background noise and some creepy door opening noises in my track. Unfortunately, I was not able to remove it, but hopefully it does not ruin your listening experience too much. Remember to subscribe and review the podcast if you enjoyed this episode or this season, and you can see what other films I'll be covering over the next few months over on our Letterboxd page, which is linked in the show notes. You can always let me know your thoughts on why Proteus is such a weird creeper by dropping me a line on hello@thefinalgirls.co.uk. And if you want to support the podcast further, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/thefinalgirls. And with all that said, please enjoy our conversation about the Stepford Wives and Demon Seed. Izzy, thank you so much for making the time to talk to me about these two genuinely disturbing films from the 70s.
Oh, it is my pleasure. I can't wait to talk to you about these. What films these are.
Motion pictures, man. We used to
Truly,
have those.
Cinema at its finest.
So before we kick off, since I'm doing this whole season about tech horror, machines, and our relationship with technology and how we're afraid of it sometimes, what was the first piece of technology that you remember owning?
I would have to say probably like a CD player. But I feel like probably the first piece of technology that I really engaged with in a way was probably like a CD-ROM video game. Like I remember getting The Sims and playing, you know, on my PC, like Storybook Weaver. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
No.
It was a very early 90s computer game where you could like write stories and basically you would select different clip art that would like act out a story for you. It was really cool.
That sounds great.
Yeah, it was honestly incredible. And they also had a version of it that was like just American Girl dolls, where you could like take the characters out of American Girl doll books and like create stories about them. It was so good. I was obsessed with it.
I love that as a concept. I want someone to make that now.
I know. I feel like it teaches really good skills like storytelling, writing, you could change the lighting. It was amazing.
That sounds great. I mean, all very important skills that are absolutely not prioritized in all educational systems.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Just give kids an iPad. It's the same thing.
Pretty much in it. Let's dive into the films we're talking about. One classic that I think a lot of people will be familiar with that has kind of entered the lexicon, and another one which was a first watch for me, and I feel like it's sort of an underseen little gem that maybe even horror fans should discover.
I agree. I hadn't seen Demon Seed either.
I know. I cannot wait to talk about it. We'll kind of interweave the conversation between the two films as we usually do. But the Stepford Wives is like a whole thing. Even the concept. What is the concept of a Stepford wife? Kind of, and how is it perceived now?
A Stepford wife has essentially become a kind of stereotype of. I mean, in the film, it's a literal sense, but I think kind of colloquially, a Stepford wife is known as a kind of robotic, perfect model of the 1950s stereotype of a housewife. She is clean. She is beautiful. She is the epitome of a kind of waspy form of American beauty. Here, it's kind of bastardized into this horror film of what it means to ask women to play that role within their lives without choice.
I'm thinking that The Stepford Wives was definitely a much more creepy watch, considering the recent rise of the trad wives on social media and the whole conversation that we've been having around that. But I wonder, what do you think is, genuinely speaking, the cultural status of this film? How do people think about it now, about the 1975 version? Or do you feel like it's sort of not really seen or screened or canonized in the same way as we do other films from the era?
I mean, I think it sort of just lives on in that term more so than as a film. I think, interestingly, when you think about the Stepford Wives and what the role that this film plays in thinking about the women's liberation movement, I think often the women's liberation movement of the 1970s gets boiled down into what the Stepford Wives is. Like, it's seen as a movement that is making white middle-class suburban women get out of the kitchen. And isn't it so great that, we're given these broader societal choices than just staying at home and cleaning and, making sandwiches. But of course, like, the women's movement was much more diverse than that and much more complicated than that. And so I think there's kind of like a limited scope to what this film can do in terms of speaking to that movement. But I certainly think it represents a sense of anxiety that women were feeling at this time and continue to feel. I mean, as you said, we've seen these trad wife influencers gain more prominence recently, and seemingly will continue to do so with, over the course of the next couple of years. This idea that, maybe they had something going that the women's liberation movement ruined. Yeah.
Do you think it's interesting, and I think it's, it's impossible to divorce it from the women's liberation movement, because both the Ira Levin novel and this adaptation, and reading a little bit as well about the way that it was then marketed and essentially tried to make really prominent feminist thinkers and agitators act as essentially influencers, supporters of the film and their marketing material. What do you think No, I know it's kind of a limited scope, but what do you think the film is trying to say about that movement? Because I've read that some people like Betty Friedan were very aggressively anti the Stepford wives. There was a little bit of a controversy about how it was received by, I guess, the women that it was trying to engage with.
Right. Well, I think it's interesting. I did some reading on this before we spoke today, and I thought it was interesting that one of the gripes that they had with it was kind of like a not all men reaction, that it's sort of like the film posits that this kind of community of men seemingly is complicit in destroying or essentially killing, I mean, I guess you could say.
Totally killing.
These women to replace them with these idealized versions of themselves, these robots. There are seemingly no men who stand up to this system, which of course, like, I assume it was meant to represent the patriarchy. But I think what they were sort of upset about was the fact that any progress needs to be achieved together. You can't simply just have women standing up against the patriarchy. It needs to be everybody. So this idea that, all men are bad was one of the things that they found that the film didn't really address in a nuanced way. And I think that's very funny to me. That's not a criticism I would have ever come up with myself personally. But yeah, I think, it's limited, but I think it does a really good job. I could see myself at the time in the 1970s watching this film and being like, it's not doing what I think it should be doing regarding feminism and where we are and what the movement is doing. Similar in the way to, I think, a lot of people responded to Barbie, but now kind of looking back at it as an expression of anxiety, of looking back at a generation who had been raised essentially to either be a teacher, a nurse, or a housewife, and to want so much more for yourself. I think it does represent that desire. It's a very simple, I think, premise and expression of that desire, but I think it potently achieves that.
Yeah, I found it's interesting with IR11 novels. They are, I don't know if you've read the original Stepford Wives book, or any of his other books.
I haven't, no.
So I think he's writes in a really readable, all of his books are really compulsive reads, and they all kind of have this great premise, right? Rosemary's Baby, Sliver, the Stepford Wives, these have all been adapted into films that have now become, to one degree or another, classics. Except Sliver. Yeah. Nobody really talks about Sliver, and it's fine. They really shouldn't. But I think that you all have these amazing central premise that's really simple, and everything else hangs on that one anchor. But then they're always, I think in the case of both Rosemary's Baby and The Stepford Wives, the film, the direction and the choices that they make really elevate and the concept and try to say something else. And we'll talk a little bit about the way that this film looks, this like very white, very beige, very flowery Connecticut kind of bright landscape that it creates, but kind of sticking a little bit further on the way that it engages with the feminist movement of the time. I wonder, what did you make about the scene of the consciousness raising attempt that Joanna and Bobby do with the wives of Stepford before they realize what's really going on?
Oh man, that really hurts my soul watching that. It makes me so sad. I mean, and this is, I think, really relevant to, I mean, what we're talking about today, which is, the way technology and the way it develops and the way it interacts with how we perceive ourselves as humans. Like, one of the things that I worry about the most with modern technology and like the way that you can have things be generated for you is the way that it robs you of your language and your self-expression. And how it just feels like there's a vacancy of feeling and thought And that's what I feel like is expressed so well in that scene, which is like, we do know they're literally programmed with certain kinds of with a certain vocabulary, or they have certain feelings, or they don't worry about certain things. And so when they're asked to be opinionated and to think, and they can't do it, and it just makes me so sad just watching them completely blankly stare at the two women who are asking them to like analyze their own lives, and they can't do it, and they just revert back to this conversation I think about baking soda, like soap, or I don't know, Ajax or something like that. And it's awful. I think Paula Prentice's character is just like, holy cow. And I was like, exactly. It's just so shocking to see humanity like reduced to that, I guess.
There's two things that I remember that scene make me feel, and it's really interesting how you phrase it about like technology removing our ability to express ourselves. There's two things, because the Stepford wives, the Stepford robots, they're kind of not even AI, because they're not even artificially intelligent. They're just not intelligent at all, in the sense that they've been programmed with a very limited amount of actions, phrases, words, and behaviors, and they just rotate between those. And that is already like kind of deeply saddening, because you know that their brilliant engineer husbands, or you know, the big bad guy, they haven't even bothered to make the robots intelligent. They're just there to perform an incredibly limited amount of tasks. And the choice of the language as well. There's another really, it's played for laughs, but when I was rewatching it for this episode, I found it so disturbing. Like the sex scene, which we don't see, but we hear when Joanna and Bobby walk into the house of one of their neighbors, and they hear this woman just like comically, scream off the top of the top of her head, but also say this ridiculous shit like calling her husband a master and the best in the world and all of this stuff. And I could not help but imagine the husband programming in the sentences that he wanted to hear from his wife in bed.
I know. I loved later though too when she was describing seeing the real couple in real life, and she was like, not that guy. She was very much like, oh, I absolutely don't believe it. She's like, that woman is gorgeous and he is not. What's going on with this?
But also this fucked up thing that is like, it's played for laughs in the film, but their obsession with this baking soda, whatever it is brand that they keep bringing up, I'm like, which one of the guys is a sales rep for that brand and made a deal with the evil scientists to make sure that every one of these robot women are plugging his particular baking soda?
All of these men are so deeply insecure and entitled. And if you understand that, then you can understand the way that these women are programmed, and you can understand like why they're able to do certain things that they do. So, you know, we see multiple examples of Walter having no idea how to entertain a kid for like 5 seconds. He has no clue, and she has to tell him, you know, they love Sesame Street, just sing along with them. Can't you figure this out while I'm in my dark room finishing my photos, you know? And he has no patience for it. He doesn't care. He doesn't want the responsibility. So he will program her to not want to do photography. So it's never a problem, you know, that she's going to be occupied and doing something else other than mother his children for him. There's no sharing of responsibility. He should be sated in all areas and feel in charge and superior. And that's how they're programmed. He is the champion. He is the best, you know, sexual partner you could ever ask for. And that's it.
I like that you bring up Walter. How would you describe the relationship between Joanna and Walter before and after they arrive in Stepford?
Well, you know, I don't think these two people should be married.
To be frank, everyone in Stepford should divorce. Like,
true. I mean, yes.
This film is an advertisement for divorce.
Absolutely. I agree. I think they're facing hurdles that I think a lot of couples go through, or certainly like the domestic drama typical couple is going through this. It's like something isn't working. It's a little contentious. There isn't very clear lines. There isn't a very clear line of communication between the two of them. And you can see how it's sort of deteriorating their relationship. She articulates how he doesn't really care about her wants and desires. So he'll do something and then sort of ask her later if that's okay. So she's not really included in their decision making. And it seems like she thinks that they're in the process of repairing that relationship. Like, even if moving to Stepford wasn't exactly what she wanted to do, she sees it as a good faith effort at starting anew and trying to figure out how they can move forward together. Whereas he, I think, sees it as he's getting everything he wants. And eventually, yes, that is exactly what happens. But I think Joanna, I really love her character. In this film, I think she's so bold and unafraid of saying what she really thinks. I mean, sometimes she talks to people and about people in a way that I'm just like, damn, you tell them, she's a tough cookie.
I wonder what you think about Catherine Ross, who plays her. When I was rewatching it, I was thinking, like, she kind of represented a new generation of Hollywood actors as well, especially after the role she plays in The Graduate, almost a decade before this film comes out. How does that off-screen persona also play into the way that we perceive Joanna?
Yeah, I was thinking about this quite a bit too, because, there's the film is obviously drawing a contrast between these women who are impossibly made up and beautiful just to kind of be at home. It's sort of like an unrealistic understanding of what womanhood is, versus Joanna, who's, she's in jeans. She's just walking around. She's more natural. She doesn't mind looking a little messy or, not wearing a bra or any number of things. And I was thinking about like the way that actors, or specifically actresses in the 30s and 40s, the generation before Catherine Ross's, was expected to look and behave. Not all women's roles in films in the 30s and 40s were domestic, but if they were, and if they had jobs even in their films, like, they were expected to look beautiful and perfect all the time. You would never see a Joan Crawford looking the way Catherine Ross is dressed or behaves in a film from, the 1940s or 50s, I mean, with Joan Crawford, you would never see her look disheveled ever. Yeah, ever. And so it is, I think, Catherine Ross and Joanna sort of demonstrate what the 1970s was doing, not just for women, but for actresses, right? Like, we see these more unconventional stars emerge. You have like Karen Black or Shelley Duvall or even Barbara Streisand. Yep. Or you even have like the deglamming of like very conventionally beautiful people like Jane Fonda or like Diane Keaton. So there's just much more flexibility with the way that women are allowed to look on screen. But the film is sort of saying, like, don't we miss that old glamour? Don't we miss the control and the subservient beauty of these older times? It sort of wants to bring us back to that.
See, that's interesting, because I was thinking about how the film uses, this stereotypical all-American suburban beauty that really feels like it belongs more in the 1940s or 1950s, so at least kind of plays into our idea, very tinted by nostalgia. Even in this film, the 50s at this point are a throwback. That's not the way that people or women in the 70s, most of them, would dress or behave or act. And I really think like it makes this over glamorized, over made up kind of traditional idea of a woman or a housewife feel very creepy. Not just in the way that they talk, when they're talk because they're robots, we later understand that's inherently creepy, but just in the way that it's always the same patterns, it's the same color palette. There is such a uniformity to every single house, to every single woman. Even the way that they do their hair, the colors of their hair are almost identical, or kind of picked from a very, very small palette of options of what it means to look beautiful and made up, that I found myself like really freaked out whenever there was more than one of the Stepford wives on screen. And obviously the final shot is this really creepy, very bright ballet of women all walking at the same pace, all talking in it, almost identical voices through the supermarket, picking up the same things and just saying the same exact two phrases to each other. And I think it really uses that, our idea of beauty and our idea of light and safety, a big, beautiful suburban house, light, always summer, always all clean and sort of devoid of any aggression or violence or any even dirt. You know, everything is so impossibly spotless that I found it really oppressive.
Yeah, it's really unsettling. But I think Joanna also kind of says this too. There's, I think when they go to the house party, one of the first things that she attends when she's there, she says, "It's all perfect. Why don't I like it?" Mm-hmm. And it's exactly what you're talking about. It's so clean and sanitized. It's so white in more than one sense of the word. That it just becomes extremely unsettling. There's nothing. I don't know what the word is. There's nothing specific about it. It feels. It almost, you know what? It kind of it made me understand a little bit more the like 1990s like women's resentment of like Martha Stewart. Does that make sense?
Go on.
You know, because I think that was such a big part of her narrative in the 90s. It was like, yes, she's this big CEO, but isn't she kind of like reinforcing all of this like perfection and suburban housewife lifestyle that like people had been kind of trying to get away from, or like women specifically have been trying to get away from. And so there's this like resentment thrown back at her for that. And I was like, well, yeah, I guess it made me understand it. I was like, if I were growing up in the 70s and like this was a very explicit articulation of a fear that I had about the direction of my life, like, yeah, I'd be a little freaked out by Martha Stewart too.
I think it's also like such a narrow definition of beauty.
Yeah.
That it's not just boring when it's so much of the same thing. It becomes really unsettling and oppressive if you don't feel or don't particularly fit into that very, very narrow box that is deemed beautiful. It really reminded me as well, watching it, of the very first time that I walked through an American suburb. And
they're spooky.
They're so spooky, man. Yeah. I was terrified.
Yeah.
And there was no sidewalks, and I was really scared that I was accidentally walking on someone else's property or someone else's kind of lawn or something. And all the houses, there was one particular street where all the houses were very similar. Other streets, the houses were all kind of very different and idiosyncratic, and everyone's lawns were designed differently. But I remember feeling like, oh no, did I accidentally step into Stepford?
Well, I think it's just so weird when everybody has that much space. I think like there's something very comforting about being in a city where you're kind of like, there is some privacy, but you're also constantly in community, whether you want to be or not. Like when you're walking around on the street, you're around other people and you can see what they're doing. It doesn't feel like people are hiding from each other, even though I think the anonymity of cities is very comforting. But like in Stepford, for example, everybody knows who everybody is. The minute you move in, you're going to have an article written about you. And yet there's so much privacy. Like we don't know what happens behind all of these walls. We have a very limited understanding of what even happens within the men's association, aside from their planning about how to get rid of their wives. You know, it's like, what are you meeting literally every day for? Well, you know,
this is what I wanted to talk about because I think it's hilarious more than it is creepy. What do you make of the men and their little men's association in the film? How is it played? Because they're supposed to be the villains, but I'm sorry, they're the most unthreatening collection of people that I've seen on screen. Do you think that's kind
Yeah.
of part of the point, that they're sort of doing all of this nefarious shit, but they're kind of just dweebs?
Yeah, they're pretty pathetic, right? And I think that's what makes it a little more jarring and maybe familiar to women who like kind of have to deal with men who probably think that they're the shit when they're not. But one scene that I found particularly telling was the meeting that they have at Joanna's house when she's being sketched. And I think the meeting is sort of like a pretense, right, for her to be sketched. But in the meantime, they're talking about an event that they're planning to throw. And they just bicker ad nauseum about whether they should have a tag sale or a barn dance. And like, who should be running the tag sale? And like, should they happen at the same time? And it's just so silly. And I'm like, you're behaving the way that people assume housewives behave. Like, you're just jockeying over power and like a kind of dumb event. Like, that really proved to me like there is no superiority here that you think you have. Like, you are not as smart as you think. You are not as charismatic as you think. And that's how Joanna perceives the meeting as well. I mean, she thinks all of these men are very boring, and she tells Walter that immediately.
She's like, but get better friends. This is not good for you.
Truly. Yeah.
Well, what I found is like both, I kind of don't even like want to overanalyze it, because I think neither the film nor the book do this, because when they don't really have a grand plan, they're just like, oh, we just want a wife with bigger tits. Literally that is also what they do to Joanna. Like, when they replace her, they give her bigger breasts. It's like, and when they're asked by her, it's like, why would you do this? Why would you do this to your partners, to your wives, to the mothers of your children? It's like, because we can.
Yep.
There's nothing grander and nothing deeper than that. And I'm kind of resistant to even try to overanalyze it, because I'm like, I don't think it's that deep for them.
Oh, yeah. It's honestly terrifying, because I do think like that is what's crazy is, we can look at that and say, I don't think it's that deep, but I could look at so many technologies that are like very harmful today that people it's the same rationale. Like, we're doing it because we can.
Yes.
And there's no philosophical reasoning behind it or thought as to the ethics or morals of it. It is simply, we can, so we will. And that's what's very terrifying about it. I mean, but it's also literally the premise of like Jurassic Park. You know what I mean? Like,
yes.
It's just the hubris of all of this and how destructive it is very terrifying.
There's another thing that I wanted to discuss, which I think kind of will lead us in nicely into Demon Seed. The other thing that's really creepy, outside of the fact that all of these men are literally murdering their wives, even though the word murder is never uttered, we don't really see any blood, we don't see any like violent murder scene. The implication is very clear. They're getting rid of the quote unquote organic wives and replacing them with the with the robot versions. But what I realized we're watching the film is like, it's also a film about sexual slavery, because these robots are essentially designed by the men to not just clean the house and perform these, these quote unquote perfect housewife roles. They're essentially there to act as sex robots for them.
Yes, they have no agency of their own, no desires of their own. They don't have to worry about whether or not they're being satisfied. It is just they have bigger boobs and they're free to be groped whenever they want. Everything is almost just like a free labor, basically.
Totally.
It's wild.
It is one of those films that I feel like if people watch it today, it becomes even creepier, because both the trying to develop sex robots essentially as artificial sex slaves, and also trying to monetize that, and then trying to replace a lot of human work with machines, and the rise of the trad wife. All of that combined in 2025, make this a really unsettling watch, because it's not that far away.
It's really not. And if you like, you could even push it into the economic sphere too. Like, their friend, is it Charmaine? I might be thinking of a different woman, but their friend who had the tennis court, who had it ripped up, she had a housekeeper, fires her so that she can work at home. Technology's taking jobs, you know? I mean, come on. It's like, it's pretty bad everywhere you look.
And just very briefly, did you ever watch the 2004 remake with Nicole Kidman?
I did, yes. Did you like that one?
I think it's much lighter in tone than the 75 version. I always enjoy a little bit of Bette Midler, and I enjoy Glenn Close in anything, as well as Nicole. I think it's a much less, I think, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a much less accomplished film, I would say. It's a little bit more of a straight up studio production. But I do think the way that it's reacting to more of a lean in kind of feminism than the women's movement from the 70s makes it interesting in hindsight.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely feels like a product of its time for sure. Like, I could imagine another Stepford Wives being made today that's entirely different from these two. I think it's very interesting. It almost feels like it's reacting to what I was talking about earlier with the not all men thing. Not to, I guess, spoil that version for people who haven't seen it, but the ending is slightly different in the sense that Nicole Kidman's husband, played by Matthew Broderick, sort of comes to his senses in the last moments of the film and essentially collaborates with her to like trick everybody, and she wasn't actually converted, you know. And so it sort of allows for this collaborative progress to occur, but also in a way that I think, I don't know, it does some other things with Glenn Close's character that made it feel like, oh, this is kind of also women's fault. And I'm like, oh, I don't know that if that's the sentiment that I would go for, but you know.
Yeah. Also, I will say there is one particular scene which I found both like very on the nose and also kind of great, is when Glenn Close leads a Claire aerobics class. Her character's name is Claire. Yeah. And they're literally trying to make themselves into human washing machines.
Right. Yeah.
Love it.
It is a funny film, though. Especially like the first couple of minutes, they do a couple of satires of like reality shows and how bad entertainment is becoming and stuff like that. I found that very funny.
Also very, very accurate currently.
Yeah, truly.
Now,
truly.
I feel like it feels like a good moment to talk about Demon Seed, which, to be honest, I think is like a decidedly more fucked up film than The Stepford Wives.
Yeah.
Had you heard of this film before?
Only in the context of Julie Christie's career. It's kind of slap dab in the middle of a couple of like very good films she made, but it's also one of those films that you like see on IMDb and you're just like, oh, whatever, I'll do that later. You know, like you just kind of breeze over it for whatever reason because you haven't heard anything about it. So that was really my knowledge of it. I had nothing else in my brain about it.
What did you think about it on first watch?
I don't think it's like a great film, or like maybe the logic doesn't really play out in a way that I found convincing, but I also have not felt as viscerally uncomfortable watching anything as I felt during that for like a long time. It was like it made me feel physically uncomfortable watching it.
I mean, we'll get into some of the things. There's a lot of things that made me extremely uncomfortable this film. I agree. I don't think it's, perfect in so many ways, and in many ways is kind of reacting to the popularity or the success of other films, specifically, like even 2001 with the kind of evil super genius AI. But there is something really messed up about the way that it's directed. What were the elements of it that unsettled you the most?
Seeing Julie Christie tied up like that and kind of knowing where it was going, after Proteus kind of explains what its intentions are. Are we saying it? Is Proteus it, or is Proteus he? I don't know.
Let's
They?
let's go with it, because Proteus is not
It?
is not alive. I don't know. Does that feel
Yeah, I don't
disrespectful
know.
to the villain of the film?
I have no idea. Who knows?
Let's go with. Yeah, I don't know. I genuinely don't know.
And this is why gender should not exist. But anyways, yeah. So Proteus kind of expresses what its intentions are, and then you kind of know where it's going, and you see her tied up like that, and it just feels so. There's something that just hits you at like a core human level, where you can see all of her agency and personhood just stripped from her in such a like blunt way that made me feel so uncomfortable, because I don't know. It's not like I hope I never find myself in a situation like that, but like, that it could happen to you, and it's just too, I don't know. It feels so scary.
I think it was the fact that Proteus, she was trying to plead with this machine, and there was simply no point, because you can sort of try to explain why a person would attack or assault someone else, and it's complicated because it's human emotion and history and choices, etc. But this is like completely unfeeling. This is also a machine that is not being operated by someone else. It's operating itself. So how can you reason with something that is on paper reason itself? It kind of, if you stop to think about it for a minute, it's like, I think it's filmed in a kind of voyeuristic, slightly titillating way, which is messed up in its own right.
Yeah.
But if you think about the idea behind it, the thing that I found really chilling is that it's Proteus's voice, and the fact that this is an all-knowing AI that is, and there's a scene where Proteus talks with its creator, the husband of Julie Christie's character, and says that I am reason. It's the only emotion that you allowed me to have. Which, first of all, is like very, kind of only child energy. But also at the same time, it's like, okay, so if you're just purely logic and reason, if you are not programmed to have or able to develop kind of any other human-like emotions, then by your account, this is perfectly reasonable behavior. And that is chilling.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it was interesting to me to compare the ideologies of Alex and Susan, because they're kind of, obviously part of their divide as a couple is that they see these technologies differently and what these technologies are capable of. Susan articulates very early on that she like thinks that he's missing some kind of human element, and he's saying like, no, technology's better and it can cure cancer and all of these things. It's like you kind of get the sense that what he wants to avoid by programming something with pure reason and without emotion is mess. Like he wants to avoid conflict. It's just very clear you do this thing because it makes sense. And so like later on we see Susan at her, in her work dealing with a child who is who knows that Susan's about to leave, and she's like kind of throwing a temper tantrum. And And that's the kind of mess that Susan is willing to deal with. It's like human messiness. It's complication. It's chaos. And it's emotional. And that's the kind of mess that Alex wants to avoid by creating something that is so obviously like logical and sound and, you know, reasonable. But like, who makes the bigger mess really? Like, like what is easier to clean up? Like a child's temper tantrum or like an all-powerful, cold, unfeeling act of rationality? Like both of like Amy and Proteus are both acting out, but like one of them is infinitely more grotesque and like harder to manage. And I think that is kind of what's scary about it. It's like the hubris of believing that simply by virtue of being logical, that something is superior, and that it can be controlled because like logic is simple and it makes sense, doesn't it? Like how easy is that to map out if something is logical, but it's really not.
I think it's kind of, stay with me here, I think it's really presented through food in a really effective way. There's a couple of scenes where Proteus makes meals for Susan and describes them in this like, this is, you know, the most optimal breakfast for you. It has this many grams of protein and this many grams of fiber and this many carbs and this much fat. And it looks like the most disgusting piece of like white pink gunk on the plate. I'm like,
yeah.
I don't care that if that makes me live forever, I still don't want it. It looks gross.
It truly is that one billionaire
yes,
who is like trying to be like young forever. And he's like, his meals every day are like shredded like mushrooms and like a piece of chocolate. And you're just like, oh my God, like what's the point, honestly?
Truly, what is the point? But you mentioned kind of Julie only knowing this film because of it sitting somewhere in Julie Christie's career. We talked a little bit about Catherine Ross, but what is Julie Christie's on-screen persona? Where do you think this film stands in her filmography?
The more I thought about it, the more I found this like a really, really interesting entry in her filmography. Like not just in terms of the types of roles she plays, but also in the way that I think she expressed her interests like off screen, I guess. So on screen, I would say Julie Christie represented a kind of like freedom and like also sexual freedom. You think about Darling, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, these women who take their lives into their own hands and are willing to like control, I guess, what their bodies are allowed to do, like in a very within the sexual realm, especially. Like she is the consummate modern woman coming out of like the 1950s into the early 1960s. She was seen as like a very cool, like aspirational girl. She was like defining what it meant to make your own path, I guess. And so that I think is also what makes seeing her tied up so viscerally chilling, is because like this is a woman who we're used to seeing as like, you know, maybe she's going through a lot, but she to a certain extent usually has control over her destiny in a way, or she like wants to, or she's fighting for that. And we're used to seeing her on that journey. So to see her so out of control is very jarring. And then I think off screen, you know, she was kind of, I think, you know, just as active in leftist politics as like a Jane Fonda or Vanessa Redgrave. But she's a very private person. Like she loves privacy. She was very insistent on like not altering her taste to like just take roles because, you know, that would have been good for her career. Like she wants to make the things that she likes. She is was very active in women's rights. So like I can imagine her looking at this screenplay and saying like, this is exactly what I'm interested in, because it is about, you know, dehumanization. It's about your body. It's about your private choices. It's about like how valuable it is to have your own taste and to have your own decisions, and not for yourself and not for anybody else. So I sort of think it like fits her ethos personally really well, in addition to kind of like using her persona in a way that turns it on its head and makes it very scary.
It's also the fact that, and this is something I wanted to talk about too, is she gets locked in her house by Proteus. So this space that is already kind of irritating for her because it's been adapted according to the preference of her husband as opposed to her. Everything is kind of run by tech, but it makes it more annoying and complicated than it should be. And then it locks her in. She literally cannot leave. And Proteus even impersonates her, which again, I think now is so everyday that someone
So
could
scary.
just deepfake someone's face or voice, or just AI, like put an AI mask over a video of someone to make it look like it's someone else. Like the fact that there is a couple of key scenes where that is done, especially through a doorbell camera. 1977? What the fuck?
I know. Yeah, no, it's so much scarier now. Because this could happen. Like I could make a video of Julie Christie saying all of these things right now if I wanted to.
Exactly. So it's like we're getting closer to some of the abilities that are here a source of terror or a source of horror from Proteus. But yeah, I found it really, really creepy that essentially this machine can lock her into this house, and it can do it only because it has been so, decked out with all the tech that Alex relishes. But that is imprisoning her in this home, which again, kind of going back to what we were discussing with the Stepford wives, essentially it's like forcing her into the role of a housewife and also forcing her into the role of a mother, literally against her will, but in a much more aggressive way.
Well, I mean, one of the things that kind of confused me about this is like, why, if you could do all of this, like, why would you even want to be a human? I didn't really understand why Proteus was like going through all of this, to be honest. But I think the excuse given is like, my child will not be ignored like I am. And I'm like, are you being ignored? It seems like you could do literally whatever you want. I don't get it.
Let's talk a little bit about Proteus. How is Proteus designed, portrayed, and how does it fit sort of in our other big cultural AI villains, like obviously HAL 9000 from 2001, Skynet, or even Megan more recently?
Well, okay, can I be vulnerable?
Of course.
I haven't seen The Terminator or Megan. I know.
God. You're
in
for such a treat.
I look forward to seeing those one day. So, but I don't know how to
that's okay.
Compare them, I guess. But I would say, I mean, it does feel kind of like a trope at this point, or I don't know if it would have felt like this at that time, but it's funny to me how similar it feels to HAL 9000, like just this kind of monotone, all-knowing, all-seeing entity that cannot be physically isolated, like it is everywhere, and seemingly has no limits, and sort of exposes our over-reliance on these machines, and the assumption that we will be able to control them forever, that there are like limits to our control. I think he's much more, gosh, I don't know. To me, Proteus feels much more insidious than HAL.
Interesting.
Is that crazy? It's been a while since I watched 2001, so maybe I'm like misremembering this, but
I think HAL is a bit more playing games. Like HAL won't reveal all of its cards until the right time.
Right.
Which is why like
deception is like a big part of it too.
Yeah.
They're both gifted with the ability to deceive, I guess.
But I feel like Proteus is a little bit like very brutal and blunt in the way that it communicates. It's like, listen, right now, this is the plan. I am going to rape you. I am going to inseminate you, and you will bear my child in the next 28 days, and you will eat this and do this and go to bed at this time. So that is a plan, and we're all on.
Yeah.
That's a schedule.
There's something about him, or there's something about Proteus, like, wanting to very specifically, like, get at somebody's body that I find very chilling, you know, versus kind of, like, subsuming power over a ship.
Well, it's the wanting to essentially feel, there's, the script kind of puts it in weird ways, you know, like, I want to feel the sun on my face. I want to be immortal, and I'm immortal by bearing children. That's how they continue it. But there's also another thing of like AI that thinks it knows better than humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminded me, I don't know if you've seen this film called Colossus, The Forbin Project.
No, I don't think so.
It's also from the 70s. It's from 1970. And it's also about a supercomputer that is created by the US government, and it gets very smart too quickly. And it basically starts communicating with the Soviet supercomputer. And
work, okay.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. But it's very, I don't think I've seen anyone ever talk about it, and I wanted to, it's my excuse to bring it up as part of this season. But it's very similar to Demon Seed, because Colossus in the film doesn't have a voice, and he basically forces the US people to build a text so he can speak through a voice, so he can like articulate his commands. But also, he becomes very obsessed with the lead scientist, who's Dr. Forbin from the title, down to the point where he's like, he demands to install cameras in all of the angles of his Dr. Forbin's house, so he can watch him at all times. He tells him when he needs to go to bed, what he needs to do, what he needs to eat, how much work he needs to do. And even to the point where Forbin is like, okay, but I have needs. He's like, how many times a week do you have needs? And Forbin is like, well, every day. And Colossus is like, be serious. How many times a week?
Oh my God. Wait, I'm adding this to my watch list right now.
Honestly, it's amazing. Because there's this huge control of like humans' bodies, and sex is involved in there. I mean, like, Demon Seed is not about sex. It's about like, you know, forced procreation. Yeah. But in Colossus, the Forbin Project, there's several scenes where Colossus is like, okay, you have 2 hours for fornication, and you cannot, there's one room that doesn't have my eye on it, and you have to go there for exactly 90 minutes or you know, 120 minutes, but you have to go in there without any clothes on, because I don't trust you to not have microphones or tools in your clothes. So it's this intense, almost desire to be a part of humanity or be with someone by just controlling everything about them and controlling and monitoring their bodies, their intakes and output, really.
Yeah, it's all of this stuff is really what is getting at. I mean, I really feel it with these films right now, the horror of it, because I just feel like it is so important for us to think about like human dignity and vis-a-vis technology these days. Like, as I said before, so much of what I worry about, like, I think about all those articles that are coming out about like kids who are, you know, learning how to write through ChatGPT. Like, they don't know how to express themselves unless they're like given a paragraph to start from, you know, or like just like the choices and all of these things that are being robbed of us to make us want less from ourselves and of ourselves, and like value ourselves less and value what technology gives us more. It just makes me very sad, like, all the time. And there's a new article about it all the time. Like all of the antisocial age is the most recent one about how, you know, people are truly just isolated at home, like on their phones more so than ever, and it's making everybody depressed, and that makes me so sad. And so like all of these things that are horror expressions of like the way we give ourselves to technology and the way that technology takes from us is hitting me harder than I think it might have maybe like 5 years ago. If that makes sense.
Yeah. And I wonder what you thought of the of Susan's choice in the end, or whether it was even a choice. Why do you think she accepts being impregnated by Proteus in the end after much coercion? Or do you think that she ever really had a choice, or it's just the illusion of a choice because she's been forced and imprisoned by this AI?
I mean, this is something I kind of struggled with because I guess I do wonder if there was a real choice. I mean, it sounds like she kind of presents the option of like, well, I'm just going to kill myself and then what? And he's like, Proteus is like, I don't really care. You know, I can do this anywhere or whatever. I forget exactly how he responds to that. But I think ultimately she does see that the only way she might reasonably get out is if she does this. And then it also seems like Proteus is wielding her trauma against her. He's sort of uses memories of her deceased child to remind her of like why she might want a kid. And then baby Proteus actually looks like her dead child.
Completely. It's like a clone.
Yeah. So it seems like it's sort of manipulating her mind in order to ensure its own life beyond itself.
I kept thinking when I watched the ending of Titan, the Julie Ducournau movie, about, well, it's quite fun and kind of campy and much less emotional than the ending in Titan. But at the end of it, it is like this child is the product of machine and human. And in Titan, it's kind of it's a very joyful moment because, you know, and from interviews that I've done and I've read with Julia, you know, she always saw this as kind of, you know, a new, stronger kind of mankind being born. But the ending in Demon Seed is like, oh no, this is the Antichrist. Like, this is a creature born from a machine that wants to dominate the world by any means necessary. And now he has a body. Mm-hmm. What do you think of the ending? How did it leave you?
I mean, it's very haunting to me, I guess, for that very reason. I mean, I think the decision to keep Proteus's voice in the child is very funny to me. It's a little campy. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think it sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier about the way this machine is kind of able to manipulate the human feelings that we have in order to ensure its own survival. I think a lot of technology works that way, like convenience or appealing to emotion, the way things are gamified so that we feel like we're getting something out of an app or whatever. It's like all kind of goes back to this kind of psychological relationship we have with technology and the way that technology is engineered to appeal to that. And this is like a more intense, I guess, version of that, which is just this way of forcing care upon this woman and this child simply because of her own trauma and psychology. That made me think about that a lot. It
does feel like both of these films in a way are about these systems, either this tech, these machines, or the men that operate them or set them up are designed to control women. Kind of watching them back to back, it really made me think of how they're using houses to imprison them, about how they've created all of these advancements, technological advancements, and they're using them to regress and to entrap their partners. And in the case of Demon Seed as well, is to like enforce them into bearing children that perhaps they do not want. And I think the way that Proteus kind of so cynically kind of plays on Susan's memories of her child who died as a reminder, is like, no, that is what you're meant to do. That is, you're meant to be a caretaker. You're meant to bear children. My child, specifically.
These films are kind of like the most literal interpretation of objectification that I can imagine. You know, it's like there are scenes in Demon Seed where Proteus is handling Susan like she's on an assembly line. I mean, how many videos have we seen of, you know, a little robot hand putting together like a box of whatever? And that's what it felt like. He was picking her up and putting her, you know, on the bed and preparing her for insemination, like in a very similar kind of cold way, where it's just, this is a tool to get done what you need to get done and nothing more. That's it. And that's a very dark feeling to me.
What do you think? We haven't really talked about the way that the machines are actually like designed in the film, because in Stepford Wives, it's all very light touch, you know. One character gets stabbed, she doesn't bleed, she short circuits. At the end, when Joanna sees her double, it's kind of exactly like her, but with these black eyes that don't have eyes inserted yet. But in Demon Seed, Proteus kind of takes control over and kind of MacGyvers himself a metallic kind of body, but he also takes over all of the tech that is within reach. What do you think about the way that the machinery is designed in Demon Seed?
I mean, I think it's kind of silly. Can I say that?
Yeah, of course.
Have it, you know, this triangular body that doesn't really, to me, it doesn't really amount to much, right? I mean, I think it plays some role in the actual birthing of the child, and I think murders her friend, but I don't know that you would need a body to murder her friend. You could probably find any way to do it. But anyways, yeah, I think it just seems like it's trying to make a movie monster, but like doesn't really have a sense of how it's going to do that. Does that make sense? It's like, it's just sort of this vague shape that isn't altogether very intimidating, and kind of looks cartoonish to me.
I mean, the murder by, I don't even know how many sides it has. So the octagon, floating brass octagon situation that just clamps around people to intimidate them. It's kind of hilarious. Like, this is the sort of shit that I love from films from the 70s and then from the 90s when everybody was afraid of the internet and computers. Yeah.
And then I think most of the time we see Proteus, we see it as like a screensaver. Basically.
Scary screensaver.
Scary screensaver for sure. Which also, you know, I think that's it playing out of the Hal book, I guess.
Yeah.
As, you know, like a little lens or whatever Hal is.
And I wanted just to start wrapping up by thinking about like Joanna and Susan, and why do you think there's a particular reason why these characters are targeted, why they make the quote unquote perfect subject, or are they literally interchangeable? It could be any other woman because the machines don't care.
That's a great question. I mean, I think ultimately the machines don't really care very much. For Susan especially, I feel like it's almost a matter of convenience in the sense that there is a portal, I'm not sure of the right word, but a means for Proteus to access her in her home in a way that doesn't exist really anywhere else. So really, anyone that he could access, it would work. With Joanna, it seems like it really is indiscriminate in the sense that any woman who is disagreeable or has ambition or doesn't do exactly what her husband wants her to do, it can be subject to that technology. So just short of perfection is reason enough to be subject to that treatment. So to me, yeah, I guess it could be anyone. It could be anyone who falls short or just happens to be in the wrong space.
I think that's what makes it creepier for me, is that it doesn't actually matter who they are, how they live their life. You know, especially Susan in Demon Seed, her memories and her previous experience of motherhood is used against her. But if it wasn't that, it would be something else. Like,
Sure.
It's essentially if the AI is scrubbing through your memories and your head and your personality to pick out the things that will help it make the argument more reasonable or more logical, then it doesn't actually matter who you are. And I think that sort of makes it creepier, because it's sort of, then it's not that traditional final girl narrative or kind of, you know, perfect victim narrative. It's like, it actually doesn't matter. It could be the neighbor, but the only reason, and it's not even because Alex, the scientist, the husband of Susan, has designed Proteus. It's not like when Colossus gets obsessed with Dr. Forbin and it's only obsessed with him in particular. Here, it's just like, oh no, it's just because you've got an open terminal and I can make my way in there and lodge myself in the house.
Yeah. Yeah. Terrifying. Don't marry scientist. No, I'm just kidding.
I mean, particularly male scientists do not come off very well in these two films.
I would say that is true. Although I think that it's deeply funny to me that in the Stepford Wives, it kind of like indicts all kinds of professions. Like the fact that the main guy is known for working at Disney is very funny to me. Like he makes animatronics at Disney, and that has equipped him to make Stepford Wives. That's very funny.
It's very funny because he's like, oh, what do you do after you make animatronics? You escalate to murder.
Of course.
Or just also the fact career progression.
Yeah, like this famous cartoonist who's drawing all of the women. I'm like, what happened in your life as a cartoonist that like got you to this point where you're like essentially complicit in the murder of all of these women?
It feels like Stepford is the place where after men get fired and do not want to tell their wives that this happened, they all move to Stepford just in order to hide the fact that they no longer have jobs.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It's crazy. Also, okay, one thing that I think I kind of missed, but I wasn't sure. Is it implied that that Walter commutes into work every day?
I
like
didn't get
he
that.
still goes to the city, or like where is he going?
Well, if we stick with my rating of they actually all got fired and they're too embarrassed to say that, then they don't. They just spend the day at the Men's Association drawing and playing cards, I guess.
I don't know.
But I'm
what a mess.
I'm more interested in like, what are the robot wives doing while they're waiting? Like, what do they do when they're kind of, because they don't switch on and
brushing their hair.
Who can tell? Because the houses are already clean. Do they just sit?
Maybe they do just sit. Well, okay, one thing that I thought was really interesting was in terms of thinking about like ownership over your body being taken over is the way that when they strip the tennis court away from that one woman, because like this is 2 years after the Battle of the Sexes. You know, like that is specifically tennis is a very kind of waspy suburban sport anyway, but also it is like the sport where women were asserting authority in a way that they really.
Can you remind my listeners what the Battle of the Sexes was, Izzy?
Yes, this was a 1973, I believe, tennis match between Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs. Billie Jean King was kind of at the forefront of helping a professional women's tennis league get off the ground for the first time. And so while that was really growing in prominence and starting to do like actual professional tours, obviously there was a big backlash against it. And a former professional male tennis player named Bobby Riggs became sort of famous for saying very misogynistic things about women athletes. And he was like, I don't know, 40, 50 years old and basically saying like, these women are all terrible and I could beat any of them because women suck at sports, blah, blah, blah. And so he challenged Billie Jean King, who was the number one ranked tennis player for women, to a match. It was widely publicized, had like record-breaking views on television, and won. And so it was sort of as like, I mean, not a literal like women are just as good as men at sports, but like just a symbol of triumph, I guess, for like women's ability to have sports leagues, but like autonomy over their like careers and things like that. It was just a very big symbolic moment. So the fact that like she loves playing tennis and that is like taken away from her feels like a very pointed expression of another way. Like you are not able to use your body the way that you want to. Like it is for me. This space is for me.
That was brilliant, actually. I hadn't even thought of that association.
Yeah.
And
I love Billie Jean King. That's why I thought about it.
Is there anything about either of these films that you feel like we haven't discussed that you wanted to bring up?
I want to say I love Paula Prentice.
She's great in Stepford
I
Wives.
think she's so fun in this film. I love her character. I would be 100% friends with her if I had the opportunity. I also think that the fashion in Stepford Wives is really interesting. And we kind of touched on this in the way that everything is white and frilly, but it's also just like the shapes of the robots' fashion and they're kind of like dowdy grandma dresses that they're all wearing. It's like a big like Madonna horror thing to me where it's like you kind of have to look like a grandmother during the day, but at night you were like this sex goddess with giant tits. Like
also, they never wear trousers, if I'm not mistaken. The Stepford Wives,
That's
they always
right.
wear like these really cinched dresses or skirts, always below the knee, always in heels.
Yes.
All these like lavender, like light pinky colors, never too bright or too ostentatious. And all the time they're wearing hats. The obsession with hats in this movie is really creepy.
Yeah, it's so bizarre. Especially at the end when that's kind of how they introduce Robot Joanna is through her hat. When before she'd been wearing, jeans and like crop tops and all of these things that would mark her as a much more modern woman. It's very interesting to me. Yeah, I don't know. That's just something I was thinking about a lot this time for the first time I had watched this in a while.
And as a wrap up, why do you think people should watch Stepford Wives and Demon Seed today?
I mean, hopefully I would hope that films like this would inspire conversations about the humanity we need to emphasize when thinking about like the development of technology. like why are we making something as opposed to like can we make something, you know? But it also seems like a lot of people just watch old like sci-fi horror and they're like, wait, that's really cool, we should make that. That seems like how everything's going these days. But I also, yes, and I would also just watch it, I guess, as rights here in the United States are deteriorating with respect to, well, really all civil rights, but with respect to like reproductive rights and things like that, I think it's just important to, I don't know if horror is like the right way to remind yourself of what could happen, but maybe it is.
I think horror is always a good vehicle for social commentary.
Yeah, it's tough because it's just how do you combat it? Who knows? But it does feel cathartic in a way, I guess, just to see your fears are not, you know, unfounded. These fears have existed for a long time and they've been expressed in very different ways. And to understand that through art is really important to me. So that's why I think you should watch them.
Thank you so much for your time and for your insights. And where can people find more of your work online, Izzy?
You can find me on YouTube at BeKindRewind and on Instagram at BK_rewind. I think that's also my TikTok. I don't really use that, but whatever.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh my God, I heard your cats.
Yep, he's up.
Oh.
He's up.